My life finally seemed to be heading in the direction I had always dreamed of. Paul and I were engaged, and the wedding was quickly approaching. Planning for the big day was both thrilling and nerve-wracking. Thrilling because I was about to start a life with the man I loved, building our home and pursuing our dreams. But nerve-wracking because with each passing day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A heaviness lingered in my heart, something I just couldn't ignore. Paul was my anchor, my rock. With him by my side, my worries felt smaller. Our love was simple and steady. Even amid the chaos of wedding planning, he always found a way to remind me how special I was to him. But at home, things were completely different. Problems seemed to pile up in every corner, especially during conversations with my parents and most of all, with my sister, Sarah. I had always known Sarah was spoiled, but I never realized the extent of her self-centeredness. Everything she did seemed to revolve around her. The idea of remodeling the house? Of course it was hers. And my parents, always eager to please her, were willing to do anything to make her happy. Meanwhile, I was left on the sidelines, watching it all unfold, as if that were normal. My days were spent working hard to keep everything in order, trying to be someone my family could be proud of. And what did I get in return? Very little. My mom was never satisfied, and my dad, though he tried to keep the peace, was often absent when it came to supporting me in the battles that mattered most. Today, when I got home, I could immediately tell something was off. Before I even walked through the door, I could sense the tension. The shouting, the arguing. It was the same old story. Sarah had done something again, and my parents were, as usual, bending over backward to excuse her behavior. As soon as I stepped inside, I was met with the all-too-familiar scene. Sarah yelling dramatically, and my parents trying desperately to calm her down. "You won't believe what she did this time, Lauren," my mom said, before I had even crossed the threshold. Her voice trembled with frustration. "I don't believe anything you say anymore," I responded impatiently, already knowing what was coming next. Sarah, with the innocent look she always used to play the victim, appeared in the living room doorway. "She doesn't understand, Mom. I just asked for a little help." "A little help?" I couldn't hold back the sarcasm. "This has never been about a little help, and you know it, Sarah." The tension in the room was almost tangible. Every time I tried to talk about my life or how I was feeling, there was always a rebuttal, an excuse, a reason why my needs had to take a back seat. It felt like I was always the child expected to bear the weight of everyone else's frustrations. Paul often told me not to let family arguments get to me, but how could they not? How could I ignore the way my parents, who should have been my biggest support, crumbled every time Sarah caused a scene? How could I overlook the constant feeling of being invisible, the daughter who never had a voice? "Lauren, you're getting married soon. It's not worth fighting over this," my dad said, trying to calm the situation. But his words felt hollow, as they always did. The argument spiraled into a direction I didn't want to follow anymore. All I wanted was for things to be different. I wanted our home to be a place of peace, but that dream seemed farther away with each passing day. I wasn't sure what hurt more, the daily frustration or the simmering anger building inside me. And yet, what cut the deepest was the pain of not being heard. How could I move forward with a heart full of resentment? How could I become the wife Paul deserved when so much was still bottled up inside me, words left unspoken? That night felt like just another in a long string of others, but something inside me began to shift. I knew I would have to make a decision eventually. I wasn't sure what it would be, but deep down, I felt the answers waiting, ready to surface when the time was right. When morning came, I knew I needed to figure out what my next step would be. When morning came, I was still consumed by thoughts of the night before. The argument with Sarah and my parents had left deeper marks than I cared to admit. The words exchanged, the looks, the way they always seemed to prioritize pleasing her, it all churned in my mind like a storm. I tried to ignore it, tried to let it go, but it was impossible. The feeling of suffocation followed me everywhere, draining every ounce of patience I had left. Paul called me early, as he always did, and he could tell something was off. He had a way of sensing when I wasn't okay, as if the weight I was carrying was visible to him. I wanted to tell him everything, to explain what was going on in my head, but something held me back. Maybe it was the fear of disappointing him or the worry that he wouldn't fully understand how unbearable things had become at home. In the end, I did what I always did. I told him I was fine, my voice laced with a forced cheerfulness, pretending everything was great when, in reality, I wanted to scream. Work was a relief, a small escape. Between emails, meetings, and the day's routine, I managed to distract myself for a while. But the weight never really left. It hovered, ever present, like a shadow. With every task I completed, the anger and frustration inside me grew, and I didn't know how to handle it. It felt like I was trapped in an invisible prison that no one else could see. When I got home that evening, things hadn't improved. Sarah was sitting on the couch, her wide-eyed expression paired with a look of disdain that instantly irritated me. She didn't say much, but her silence spoke louder than 1,000 words. It was as if she was waiting for me to approach her, apologize, and take the blame for everything. I was exhausted. Exhausted from blaming, from carrying the burden of trying to be the perfect daughter, the sister who endured everything without complaint. "Are you sure you're okay, Lauren?" My mom asked with a sweet but forced tone, like she was just going through the motions. She knew how I felt, knew the pressure Sarah put on all of us, but she never did anything to change it. The worst part was that she genuinely believed she was being fair, that she was doing the right thing. But in reality, she was just feeding Sarah's ego while the rest of us were left to fend for ourselves. "Yes, Mom, everything's fine," I replied, forcing the same smile I always did. She knew it wasn't true, and I knew she knew, but she chose not to see it. She always did. Sarah got up from the couch and walked toward me with that unapologetic look, showing no sign of regret for what she had done earlier. "You're so tense, Lauren. Maybe if you stopped worrying about everything so much, things would be easier," she said, as if she'd just handed me the solution to all my problems. I felt anger rise in my throat, but I took a deep breath and held it back. "It's not that simple, Sarah. You never get it, do you? It's always been this way. Everything revolves around you, and the rest of us are just expected to deal with it," I said, letting out some of the frustration I'd been bottling up. She shrugged, completely unfazed, as though my words hadn't even registered. "You really should stop stressing so much. Life's a lot easier when you don't take everything so seriously." I almost lost it. Almost. But somehow, I kept my composure. I knew yelling or arguing wouldn't make a difference. She would never understand. She never did. It was always the same, and I was so tired of it. Tired of fighting to have a voice in a place where it felt like I didn't matter. That night felt endless. My parents sat in silence, as if they had resigned themselves to the idea that nothing would ever change. And maybe that was the hardest part. The sense of powerlessness, the realization that no matter how hard I tried, everything remained exactly the same. When I finally lay down, still trying to process everything that had happened, one question kept echoing in my mind. How did I get here? How could I have been so blind to think that things would ever change? I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't let me. Scenes from my life played out like an endless movie. Paul, my love, my hope for a different life. Sarah, always manipulating, always getting exactly what she wanted without ever giving anything in return. And my parents, who, despite their love for me, couldn't see the reality right in front of them. I felt lost. I didn't know what to do or what my next step should be. But one thing was clear. I was getting closer to making a decision. Something inside me was telling me I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in a vicious cycle of anger and frustration. Something had to change. And deep down, I knew that change would have to start with me. What I didn't know yet was how big that change would be or how it would unfold. On top of everything else, there was something strange happening to me. Over the past few days, I'd felt an inexplicable sensation in my body. A persistent, almost unbearable itch. It was as if something was growing and spreading beneath my skin, burning and slowly driving me crazy. But somehow, I tried to ignore it. With so many other problems weighing me down, a simple itch seemed like the last thing I should be worried about. The morning started like any other. Sarah was sprawled on the couch, glued to some reality show, acting as if her life was a fairy tale. "Are you planning to stay on that couch all day?" I asked, trying to keep the irritation in my voice under control. She glanced at me with a smirk, her signature look of mockery. I already knew what was coming. It was always the same. She acted as though everything was perfectly fine, while I struggled to hold myself together. "Of course I am. Do you have a problem with that?" she replied, her eyes never leaving the screen. The way she said it made me feel like I was the one being unreasonable, as if I had committed a crime by questioning her sacred comfort zone. To her, I was just a nuisance, someone disrupting her perfectly curated routine. My patience was wearing thin. That strange itch I had been feeling for days was getting worse, as if something inside me was building up, ready to burst. I wanted to scream, but instead, I took a deep breath and turned toward my parents, who were in the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones, pretending not to notice the tension in the air. "I need to get out for a bit. I'm not staying here all day," I said flatly, barely mustering the energy to speak. "You're really going out like this? Looking like you've already lost your temper?" my mom asked, her tone laced with disapproval. She gave me that critical once-over, the kind that made me feel like I'd done something wrong just by existing. "It's time you grow up, Lauren," she added, as if wanting a moment of peace for myself was a sign of immaturity. I wanted to snap, to tell her exactly how I felt, but instead, I turned and walked out the door without saying another word. My hands were shaking, and the need to escape that toxic atmosphere was stronger than anything else. As soon as I stepped outside, the warmth of the sun hit me, and the fresh air provided a brief, fleeting sense of relief. But as I walked through the neighborhood, the itch persisted. It was impossible to ignore, like something crawling under my skin, growing stronger with every step I took. I paused for a moment, staring at my hands, as if I could find some answer there. Something that would explain what was happening. But there was nothing. Just the overwhelming feeling that my body was no longer mine to control, that something was deeply wrong. And then, like a sharp blade, the thought cut through my mind. I can't do this anymore. It wasn't just the itch consuming me. It was the life I was living. The lack of respect, the constant pressure to be the perfect daughter, the sister who bore everything without complaint. I didn't even know who I was anymore, and that terrified me. It felt like I was losing control, as if everything could come crashing down at any moment. When I got back home, things were worse. Sarah was as unbearable as ever, lounging on the couch, pretending nothing had happened, like always. It was as if, in her mind, I was the one responsible for all the problems. I knew she wouldn't change, but something inside me was screaming that I couldn't keep being the victim. I couldn't keep being Lauren, the one who stayed quiet, who always gave in. "You're acting weird today," Sarah said as soon as I walked through the door. Her eyes glinted with that smug satisfaction she always wore when she thought she had the upper hand. She loved seeing me on edge, loved pushing me to my breaking point. "Of course, you're being dramatic as usual," she added with a smirk. I tried to ignore her, but the itching under my skin only intensified. Each word she spoke felt like a match, sparking my frustration and desperation. "Just leave me alone, Sarah," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. Inside, though, I felt like I was falling apart. It was as if I were standing on the edge, about to lose control, and that terrified me more than anything. But Sarah, predictably, didn't stop. "Oh right, because you can't handle anything, can you, Lauren? Always with that face, like the world's out to get you," she sneered, her tone dripping with mockery. I couldn't take it anymore. "You're absolutely right, Sarah," I snapped, my teeth clenched with anger. "I'm the dramatic one, the one who can't handle anything. But what I can't stand is how you think everything revolves around you, with your holier-than-thou attitude." The silence that followed was almost tangible. For a moment, it felt like even the air had stilled, heavy with the weight of the words I'd finally spoken. But then she looked at me with a cruel smile, as if she had somehow won, as if my frustration validated her. "Well, it's about time you figured it out," she said, her tone so light it made my blood boil. I took a deep breath, trying to suppress the urge to snap, but deep down, I knew I couldn't keep living this way. I couldn't keep being the person everyone expected me to be while anger churned inside me like a storm waiting to break. Something had to give, and maybe, just maybe, I would have to be the one to start the change. That night, the itching on my skin kept me awake again. It was relentless, like something was consuming me from the inside, though I couldn't pinpoint what. There was a voice within me, screaming for action, for something to be done, but I was paralyzed, unsure of where to even begin. I felt utterly lost. But one thing was certain. I couldn't keep living like this. The itch didn't relent, especially in quiet moments, when I was alone in the bathroom or trapped in my thoughts. It felt like my skin was on fire, as though an invisible agony was spreading through every corner of my body. Every pore seemed to cry out for help, but no one else could hear it. Only me. Deep down, I knew something was wrong, even if I didn't yet understand what. The next morning, I made a decision. I was going to see a doctor. I didn't know what I'd find out, but I couldn't keep ignoring it. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine, that I was fine. My parents likely wouldn't even notice. absorbed in their own concerns. And Sarah? She'd dismiss it entirely as always, unless it inconvenienced her perfect little world. Are you seriously going to the doctor for that? Sarah mocked as I passed through the living room. She was sprawled on the couch, as usual, watching TV. Oh please, Larissa. It's just an itch. Stop turning it into a whole production, she sneered, laughing, her tone as venomous as ever. Her words slid off me this time, barely registering. It was what she always did. Minimizing, mocking, dismissing. I didn't have the energy to care anymore. I ignored her and went to the kitchen, where my mom was busy at the sink. I'm going to the doctor, Mom. I can't take this itching anymore, I said, keeping my voice steady even though anger simmered just below the surface. She glanced at me briefly, not pausing her task. You don't need to do that, Larissa. You're overreacting. It's probably all in your head. This kind of fuss doesn't lead anywhere. Her words hit me like a dull blade, not sharp enough to wound deeply, but painful nonetheless. I had anticipated the lack of support. I was tired of it. What hurt even more, though, was my father's silence. He sat at the table with his newspaper, as if I didn't exist. It was as though I was invisible to him, too. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I didn't want to argue anymore. I'm going to the doctor, and that's final, I said, more to myself than to her. And when I find out what's going on, you won't be able to dismiss it as me overreacting. The visit to the doctor felt like yet another exercise in being dismissed. He ran a series of tests but offered no real explanation, his demeanor brisk and detached, as if I were just another task to check off his list. It's probably nothing serious, he said while jotting notes in my file. But we'll do some blood work and analyze a skin sample. If it doesn't improve, then we can consider further steps. I wanted to ask more questions, to press for answers, but fear of being labeled dramatic kept me silent. His indifferent attitude only reinforced the idea that my suffering wasn't real, at least not to him. Once again, I felt like I was just making a fuss. When I returned home, the feeling that something was deeply wrong only grew stronger. The itching persisted, but the real discomfort came from how everyone around me seemed to perceive me. As I walked in, I was greeted by Sarah, ever poised for another snide remark. She looked up with a fake smile. I'm the only one in this house actually doing something with my life, she said, her tone dripping with mockery. And you? You're just here, pretending to be sick. Maybe you need a reality check because, honestly, this is all in your head. I wanted to scream, to force her to see how much her words were hurting me, but I didn't. What was the point? She would never understand. She never did. And my parents? They were, as always, more concerned with maintaining appearances than addressing what was really happening with me. Are you okay, Larissa? My mom asked, her voice detached, devoid of genuine concern. She wasn't really asking. She wanted reassurance, wanted me to tell her everything was fine so I could slip back into the role of the compliant daughter who never made waves. But I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't pretend that everything was okay when it wasn't. No, Mom, I'm not okay, I said, my voice low but steady. I'm really not okay, and you won't understand. Not until it's too late. Beside me, my fiancé Marco stood unwavering, his presence a lifeline. He wasn't like the others. He cared. His gaze carried genuine concern, his hand gripping mine tightly, grounding me as everything else seemed to fall apart. I'll be with you, Larissa, he said, his voice steady and comforting. We'll figure this out together. I'm not leaving you alone in this. Those words brought me some relief, a flicker of hope amidst the storm, but it wasn't enough to extinguish the growing fear. The fear that no one else truly cared about what I was going through. I returned home with no answers, only more questions and an unsettling feeling that whatever was happening to me was far more serious than I had initially thought. I yearned for control over my own body, but it felt like I was losing it. My skin, once a mere barrier, now seemed to be the harbinger of something unknown, something I could feel deep in every cell. And deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. Something within me was changing, and it wasn't just the relentless itching. It was something deeper, something far beyond what I could grasp. The itching worsened, consuming me. It wasn't just discomfort anymore, it was agony, a searing pain that spread across my skin like a fire that refused to burn out. Every inch of my body felt like a battlefield, and what had started as manageable was now a war I was losing. It was during my latest visit to the doctor that things began to make sense. This doctor was different, attentive and meticulous. There was something in his demeanor, a quiet confidence that made me feel, for the first time, that someone was truly listening. After conducting more thorough examinations, the pieces finally started falling into place. He examined the results, his expression grave. "Larissa, you have a rare allergy, a very rare one. It's attacking your skin intensely, and if left untreated, it could worsen significantly." I wasn't sure if the wave that swept over me was relief or sheer panic. The itching, the bruised marks, the relentless pain, they finally had a name. But deep down, I knew this diagnosis was only the beginning of the burden I'd have to bear. "You'll need to follow the treatment precisely," the doctor continued, his tone firm but compassionate. "But more importantly, you need to manage your stress. Emotional or psychological tension could exacerbate your condition." His words echoed in my mind as I left the office, lost in thought. I didn't even realize Marcos, my fiancé, was walking beside me until he gently touched my arm. "Larissa, what's wrong? Are you okay?" he asked, his concern evident. I nodded weakly, barely able to speak. I have a rare allergy, Marcos." I knew something was wrong, but now we finally know what it is. He pulled me into a tight hug, offering the support I so desperately needed. For a brief moment, the relentless itch and pain seemed to fade into the background. At least I wasn't alone in this. Returning home, I thought having an explanation for what was happening to me would bring some sense of relief. But instead, it left me feeling even more unsettled. The heavy atmosphere in the house, the unspoken tension among my family, was becoming unbearable. Something was brewing, and I could feel it in every fiber of my being. That night, after everyone was home, I decided it was time to speak up. Armed with the certainty of my diagnosis, I felt it was the right moment to confront everything. My condition and the dynamics within my family. "Mom, Dad, Sarah," I began, my voice shaky but resolute. "I know what's been happening to me. I have a rare allergy, something that's been tearing me apart and could get worse if I'm not treated. But there's more I need to share with all of you." My father didn't even look up from what he was doing, his disinterest palpable. My mother's face was a mix of mild concern and impatience, while Sarah's expression bordered on indifference. But I pressed on, determined to make them see the weight of what I was carrying. While scrolling through her phone, my mom seemed torn between pretending to listen to me or focusing on her soap opera. "But Sarah. Oh, Sarah." She gave me that smug, condescending smile that always made my blood boil, as if she was completely certain I was just overreacting. "You know, Larissa," she said, her voice dripping with disdain, "if you spent more time fixing your own life instead of making up problems, maybe you wouldn't have to worry about these imaginary illnesses." I took a deep breath, trying to suppress the anger rising within me. I didn't want to lose my temper, but something inside me snapped. I couldn't hold it in anymore. "I'm done pretending this is normal," I began, my voice shaking but determined. "And there's something else you all need to know." The tension in the room became almost suffocating. Everyone stopped what they were doing. When Marcos and I started planning the wedding, I put all my savings together to cover the expenses. But when I went to check the account, the money was gone. You know where it went? Into Sarah's house remodel. A heavy silence followed. My mom froze mid-movement, visibly uncomfortable. Sarah sat stiffly, her expression a mix of shock and guilt. For the first time that evening, my dad lowered his phone and actually looked at me. I could feel the air thick with surprise, guilt, and even shame, but none of it made me feel any better. You took my money?" My voice cracked, but I pressed on. "You used my savings without telling me, without even considering what that money meant to me? What happened to my future? To my wedding? While I've been fighting for something meaningful, you just threw it all away." My mom avoided my gaze, clearly flustered. Sarah, as always, tried to mask her discomfort with sarcasm, offering a weak, nervous smile. "Larissa, calm down," my dad finally spoke, his tone more defensive than apologetic. "We were just trying to help Sarah. She needed it, and well, you wouldn't have even noticed the money was gone, right?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could they be so thoughtless? How could they treat my dreams and sacrifices as if they were insignificant? "Do you think I'm stupid?" I asked, my voice firm and my anger barely contained. "Do you really think I wouldn't care? I was working so hard, saving for my wedding, for my future, and you just took it, like it didn't matter. And that's when something inside me finally broke. It was as though a dam had burst, releasing everything I had been holding back for so long. I knew in that moment that I had to say it all, no matter what happened next. I wasn't about to stop there. After everything I had done for this family, everything I sacrificed, I never thought it would come to this. But now they were going to understand. I looked at the three of them standing in front of me, uncertain and unprepared, and with a cold smile, I delivered the final blow. Now you'll pay. Not just for what you did to me, but for everything you forced me to keep hidden. Get ready, because nothing I do from this point forward will be more shocking than the truth I'm about to reveal. I let the silence linger, knowing that this would be a night they'd never forget. Fast forward to now, standing at the altar, ready to take the most significant step of my life. Marrying Pedro. This moment should have been filled with joy and celebration, but for me, it was a declaration of freedom. Freedom from a family that never supported me, that burdened me with their mistakes, and forced me to bear the weight of their decisions. But everything changed at my wedding. They would finally face the consequences of their actions. I wouldn't let them forget. Not now, not ever. The relentless itching that once tormented me felt like a distant memory, a metaphor for the years of suffering I endured. With the doctor's assurance that my condition would improve with proper treatment and Pedro by my side, I was finally ready to begin anew. I was determined to write my own story. Free from manipulation, free from lies. As the wedding unfolded, my parents sat with stiff smiles, desperately trying to maintain the facade that everything was fine. My sister Sarah, of course, sat in the front row, her expression a mixture of disdain and annoyance. But inside me burned a fire of resolve, an unshakable sense of power and clarity. This wasn't just about exchanging vows. It was about reclaiming my life. I would ensure my family remembered everything they had done to me. They could try all they wanted to bury the past, but I wouldn't let them. Then, as the ceremony neared its conclusion, the priest asked if I wanted to say a few words. I knew it was time. Time to finally reveal the truth. What everyone had been ignoring was about to come to light. I glanced at Pedro, who met my gaze with understanding. He knew exactly what I was about to do. My heart raced, but my voice was steady and unwavering. Today is a monumental day for me. It marks the beginning of a new chapter in my life with the man I love. But before we step into this new life together, there's something I need to make clear. Something that needs to be addressed, here and now, in front of everyone. The room fell silent, and every pair of eyes was on me. I knew this moment would be more than a simple revelation. It was my chance to reclaim my dignity. I've been through a lot to get here, I began, my voice resolute. And what many of you don't realize is that while I was fighting to build my life, my own family was undermining me. They left me behind, used me and humiliated me. As if dealing with my health and the pain you never understood wasn't enough. I turned to face my parents and Sarah, who sat frozen in their seats, their faces betraying their unease. My mother looked visibly nervous, and my father's attempt at a composed expression was faltering. I knew my words were hitting their mark. You used my savings, the money I worked hard to put aside for my wedding, to renovate Sarah's house. You didn't consult me. You didn't even bother to inform me. You exploited me while pretending to support me. But now, it's time for me to make things right. With that, I reached for a stack of documents I had carefully prepared and placed on the table. It was my ace in the hole, my ultimate move. The room grew even quieter, the tension almost tangible, as all eyes fixed on me. These are legal documents proving what I'm saying, I announced. The house you live in, the place where all of this happened, will now be transferred to me. I'm taking possession of it. And as a means of addressing what you've done to me, Sarah and the rest of you will receive formal eviction notices. The color drained from my mother's face as she tried to stand, but no words came out. I turned my gaze to my father and Sarah, whose expressions oscillated between shock and panic. This wasn't what they had expected, but it was precisely what they deserved. You remodeled Sarah's house, and now it will truly be hers, and yours. If there are any issues, you'll have no one to blame but yourselves. I bore the burden of all this alone, and now I demand justice. Sarah's eyes flashed with anger, but she stayed silent, knowing she had been defeated. My parents tried to speak, but their words carried no weight anymore. They could no longer manipulate me. The house they had clung to as a symbol of power was now a reminder of their choices and the cost of their actions. I knew this wouldn't be easy for them. They would have to face the consequences of their behavior and, more importantly, confront the reality they had created for themselves. Today, on my wedding day, I've prepared something none of you will ever forget, I said with a calm smile that carried the weight of all the pain and resentment I had endured for so long. Now, they were begging for forgiveness, but I wasn't ready to make it easy for them. I had endured all of this alone, and now, finally, I was in control. As the tension in the room grew palpable, I saw the realization dawn on my parents. They were in shock, but there was no way to undo what had been revealed. Everything that had happened, every truth laid bare in that moment, was irreversible. They were now forced to confront the consequences of their decisions. I glanced at Pedro, who stood beside me, proud and relieved. He understood the weight I had carried and knew that I had finally let it go. I know it will take time for you to process this, I continued, my voice steady. But understand this. The choices you made cannot be undone. My life begins anew today, and I will not turn back. With that, I stepped forward, ready to embrace the future. No longer burdened by the guilt or mistakes of my family, I was finally free. And no one, not even them, could stop me from moving forward. Here concludes another story on our channel. See you in the next video.